Hi, welcome to Forgotten Curiosities. I'm Pooja, and I like to make things. Weird things, whatever I can dream up that I desperately need in my life. And today, I have a progress report on turning my craft room into an artificer's workshop, which is like a fantasy creator. Artificers tend to make anything from weapons to magical items, wands, armor, all kinds of fun things. And I really feel like since I make whatever it is I want to, whenever I want to, it's the perfect analog. I was hoping to have the whole room 100% done before I put out the video, but unfortunately, that's just not how things are going to go. Because scope creep, right? We're all aware that you start on a project and things just grow and grow and grow, and you want to do more and more and more. And the things that you already have committed to doing turn out to take 17 times as long as you thought they would. Yeah, I'm fully in the middle of that. So let's call this phase 1. And I am mostly going to be showing you how I refinished this cabinet behind me. It was a whole journey. This thing almost broke me, but it's done. I am really happy with how it turned out. And honestly, it was one of the biggest projects that I needed to do to get it in here. And my first time really diving into restoring furniture rather than transforming it. I don't know. I learned a lot along the way. And also I did a few other fun things around the shop itself. So let's get into it.
This is the cabinet with the hutch that I bought. I really, really love this piece, but it does need some love. And I am going to start by removing this little hardware on the inside and cleaning it off and getting to sanding. And then we will take a look, because right now the piece that needs a lot of love, this back piece is broken and kind of half taped on. These are actually two separate pieces. There's a bottom cabinet and then the top piece with the glass. So at least it'll be easy to move around and easy to work with. And then let me see if I can get in here. As you can see, this base is cracked. And so I think what I'll do is I'll actually just replace the back of the top. And then if there's a large enough piece that's still usable, I will put that down here to replace the bottom of this side of the cabinet. And if not, I'll just use the same plywood that I use on the back.
And so begins the sanding saga. One of the interesting things about this cabinet, it came in 2 pieces. That is how it is meant to be put together. There was never any place for them to be connected. And you can really see where the open space was versus what was underneath the top cabinet portion, because there was a perfectly intact stain and sealant coat above that on half of this bottom piece, and the other half nothing else. So while normally the common wisdom is that you want to do an even sanding across an entire piece, I ended up spending a lot of time on the back half of this to get it down to where all the stain and all of the finish was gone. I wouldn't recommend, if you don't have a sander, I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying one that runs on battery rather than a plug, like if you have easy access to an outlet, if just because sanding takes a lot longer than you're ever going to think it's going to take, or at least in my case it did. And so I was limited by the amount of battery power I had. Like I have a couple of batteries for the Ryobis and I was swapping them out. But at some point you're just like, okay, they both need to finish charging up and now I'm done for the moment. However, if you are interested, as I apparently was, in doing all of this in my non-climate controlled garage during a heat wave, that could be a plus rather than a minus, because I was forced to take breaks and hydrate and all of that. The other thing that I would highly recommend to everyone when you're sanding, there's a lot of dust. It's so messy. And you need to be wearing PPE, like personal protective equipment. Protect your lungs. You don't want sawdust and finish dust and all of that nastiness getting in yourself. It's toxic in the literal sense. And it sucks to have to wear it because, especially once again, when it is hot outside, it is very much a thing, like having that mask on your face. However, it's definitely worth it in the long run. I was so excited about getting started on sanding this up and everything that I didn't do one of the basic steps, which is take out the drawer and take off the doors of the cabinets before I got started sanding. It's not like it was that big of a deal, but it was funny to me at the time even that it's like, okay. And even now, I'm like, I'll just sand some more. It'll be great. Take the doors off. Pooja, just take the doors off. And here we go. I finally just bit the bullet and realized I needed to do this. The doors are held on just by a couple of hinges, as you can see, and those hinges are held on by like really small machine screws that take a flathead, and some of them are in better condition than others. So even though it was a little annoying to get them out, it wasn't difficult. Getting them back in was a little bit more of an adventure because I wanted to fit up like the hinge that went in this spot with its holes, and then some of the holes had gotten a little bit stripped out, so I needed to fill those. I ended up using a trick that I saw on Mercury Stardust Instagram, I'm pretty sure, the Trans Handyman, where you put toothpicks or the really skinny end of some skewers into the hole, and then it'll give the screw something to grab onto. Usually you would use that on like door frames. It worked great in this case as well. I'm going to be super honest. I was not really systematic about how I went about sanding this cabinet. I just, whatever portion looked like what I wanted to do next, that is what I did next. And also it helped because you can kind of start seeing it now that there are a lot of different colors of wood in the cabinet itself. So when I started, I actually wasn't sure, like, okay, how deep do I need to go? What color am I looking for that'll tell me that the stain that was used is completely gone and that the finish is completely gone? What am I looking for? So I would do a pass or two on an area, move on to another one, and then I worked my way through to a point where I was sure that everything had been completely sanded off. This little decorative piece on the corner of the cabinets, I was really, really into it when I bought the cabinet. I was like, oh, this looks so cool. It's a very interesting detail. And it didn't occur to me until I started that it was going to be a nightmare to sand. getting into all the little grooves, and even using this tiny hand sanding block that I had, it was really difficult to get in there, and I didn't want to destroy the dimensionality of that detailing. So it was rough. I started with this and then ended up moving on to something completely different. I will say that having a smaller sanding block to use by hand was incredibly helpful, both in getting the corners, like all of these little nooks and crannies, because I didn't want to try to take this entire piece apart. And so this allowed me to get into the corners, like into all the little grooves of the doors, of the back of this cabinet where pieces met, all of that kind of stuff. Much, much easier to do with a smaller sanding block. I think next, I would actually want to get one that's kind of more of a medium-sized. I think they make ones that, like, a little larger, fit in your palm better. The downside, though, and you can see it in the video, is that when you're sanding by hand, even just using the orbital sander with the little bag, this is so much more dusty. You're just covered in dust. And I have finally come back to that front detail. You can see where I had tried a couple of different things in terms of using either the sanding block or just my finger with a piece of sandpaper wrapped around it. I landed on using this tiny craft knife. It's the kind with the little snap-off blades that I had gotten. It was a really, really cheap one, to the point where when I tried to snap the blade off, it actually partially broke the casing. But I gotten it for free with my window film that I put on the patio doors. So I didn't mind using it for this, and I was being careful with it so I didn't hurt myself, basically. But I was able to use this to get a lot of that finish off of the larger portions of the grooves. And then I was just looking through everything that I had, and I realized that I had a wax carving kit I bought many, many years ago for a project, and I don't use it very often, but a few of the tools in there have really sharp points. They're made for detail work. And so I was able to use that to get the dirt and finish and everything out from those tiny, tiny grooves and help redefine them. So it was really satisfying to do, but also my hand cramped up so often. It wasn't easy, and it was a little bit painful in the end. Had it not been such a large area, and maybe had I not been so interested in keeping my face like 3 inches away from it so I could see every last bit, it would have been easier and gone faster. But neither of those things were true, because I am who I am. If anyone else has those same kind of tendencies like I do, I will give you what I keep telling myself and will hopefully one day believe. Perfection is not the goal. There is no such thing, really. And even if there was, it would be so boring. The imperfections and the inconsistencies are actually a lot of what make things visually interesting and just interesting in life. Our imperfections make us unique, make us who we are. And we shouldn't want to give those up. Also, take breaks. It's better for you in the short run and the long run.
Here's where I'm at so far. Went ahead and sanded everything. I took out the broken bottom piece and obviously like removed the doors and the drawer, and I'm going to deal with those. I've sanded them down some, but I do need to do a finish sand on those. And then I also need to clean up this hardware so I can reinstall it. This piece is the center brace for the bottom of the cabinet. So clean that up a little bit, reinstall it when I put in the new base. Looking at the thicknesses of that piece, which used to be pieces, I guess, used to be one piece, is now two. And the back of this larger cabinet, that's not going to work because this guy is like 5/8 of an inch thick, and that is closer to 3/8. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use some plywood that I have to fill in the gaps on both of those sides because I just would like slightly better. This is the cabinet that I'm going to be working on next. I'm going to remove the doors first. I'll sand these by hand because I'm terrified that if I use the orbital sander on it, I'll break the glass, and that would be horrifying. But it's easy enough to take them out. They're just little flathead screws. And then I will get to sanding and cleaning up this guy. I think I'm going to take a look closer. This top angled piece, kind of crown molding-esque, is installed a little. It's a little funky, but it's not terrible. I'm gonna see how hard it would be, like how bad it would break it if I tried to reinstall it, basically, just so it's a little bit more square along the edges. And if that turns out to be a problem, I will most likely, I have some stainable wood filler, so I might just fill that up and then smooth out this edge a little bit with the sander, but we'll see. I'm excited. This is turning out really nicely, actually, like for having just sanded it down and for it having taken forever to get these little guys cleaned out.
Hilariously, as soon as I started sanding this upper cabinet, that left-hand piece snapped off, so I was given the opportunity to try to put it back together better. First, more sanding. At this point, I bought a kind of cyclone thing to attach to a shop vac that would help filter out the dust and make the filters last longer. And I bought a new filter for my shop vac and attached it to the Ryobi. Unfortunately, the hose to my shop vac and the input hose on the Ryobi were two massively different sizes. And at this point, I refused to go back to the hardware store for anything. So I just used a bunch of painter's tape to attach the two together. And it worked remarkably well. Like better than it had any right to work. And overall, it meant that the process was so much less dusty because that was all getting collected and actually sucked out through the hose instead of just going into that tiny bag, which has the tendency to just fall off at random times, spewing dust everywhere, and doesn't collect all that much to begin with. I think the thing that really ends up feeling endless about the sanding is that after I did this set where I used really rough grit and got all of the finish off and saw what I was working with, I needed to do the repairs and then still sand it like 3 more times with successively higher grits to get it to its like final form that would be ready for stain. Because you have to go from whatever grit you started with, whether that's 80 or 120, up to 220, and for some other finishes more. But you can't just do that in one step. You really need to go in smaller pieces. So you go from like 80 to 150 or 120, and then you go from 120 to 180, and then 180 to 220. So it's all of this over and over and over again. I felt so endless. I was like, at one point I was just like, I'm never going to be done. I'm going to be sanding for the rest of my life.
are. I have sanded down all of the pieces of the original dresser and this new piece of plywood I cut for the back to 220. And I put in, like, the veneer on this is old. It had started to split, especially when I started sanding it. I found that more pieces chipped away. So I ended up filling in a bunch of those and then spots on the back or these spots on the top with some sustainable wood filler. And that is the stuff right here. It comes out like wet sand. I've never used it before. I don't know. But you let it dry for a couple of hours and then you can sand it down. And I had a clip, I'm pretty sure, that I put in of this piece when I was originally sanding and cleaning down. The cabinet top just popped off. So I did end up trying to like fit it back in better. And it worked for the most part. I did end up, just because there was a little gap here that I could not get rid of. And then a little gap in between here where the miter didn't quite fit together right. So I just put wood filler in there. It says it's sustainable. Hopefully that's true. That would be great. It would be great if that were true. I also, and I don't know if it's proper or not, but I knocked down a bunch of the corners because I found that the super sharp edges were just catching every time I ran my hand over them. I would get, small paper cut, things like that. So I just knocked them down a little bit with sandpaper to keep them from chipping out anymore. And I'm pretty happy with that. I'm pretty happy with how everything came out. I am not happy with how long this took. When I tell you I spent many days sanding for 2+ hours a day on this, I am being so serious. For the bottom, this ridiculous rig, I'm laminating 2 sheets together. We'll see how it works out. Hopefully well. And then I can just slip that in to this base here. So next steps, I cannot believe I am pretty much at least done with sanding, is I'm going to clean all the dust off of these. Once this dries, I'll need to give the base one sand. Okay, so not done with sanding. I will need to give the base a sanding, but other than that, wipe out the sawdust off of these. And then I bought gel stain. Hold on one second, I'll show that to y'all. I bought this mahogany gel stain. I thought the little bit of red tone in there would go well with the Asian style cabinet that I've got in the room already. And hopefully that's true. Hopefully it'll look nice.
Here is where the problems with this project started, I feel like. And they were all self-imposed. I did wipe down the pieces to make sure there wasn't any sawdust on them, that they wouldn't get in the stain. But I should have cleaned off the garage floor, probably put down a drop cloth or something. If you care about your floor, you should put down a drop cloth. And I wasn't using the right applicator. There were these staining sponges at the Home Depot. I thought these will be perfect. Lint-free cloths specifically made to apply stain and things like that. They were a terrible way to apply stain. Don't use them. They put on so much. And then the idea of like how you apply gel stain is you put on a coat and then you wipe it off like a few minutes later. And that brings me to my next mistake, which was that I waited way too long to wipe these pieces down. My thought process kind of was that I would do a section, come back and wipe it down. However, the sections that I was trying to cover before I wiped them off were way too big. And then it was really warm, like it was the entire time I was working on this project. So the consistency of the stain turned into like this semi-hardened glue. And it was just really, really difficult to wipe off the excess in a consistent manner throughout the entire project. So learn from my mistakes. Thin coats, don't use the towel-covered sponge or whatever. I ended up switching over to a sponge brush, and that worked out a lot better. And then work in smaller sections if you were going as slow as I was, so you can wipe off the excess before it completely sets up. Also, highly recommend you start in the back of your project and work your way forward rather than the other way around, because that way you will end up with a lot less stain on your arms that you then have to scrub off later with what basically amounts to a homemade body scrub. And we come back to these little detail bits that were a lot easier to stain than they were to sand out, thank goodness. Luckily, I had a ton of tiny sponge brushes just from, I don't even know where I got them, but so I pulled those out and was able to get the stain pretty consistently throughout all the grooves of that section. And working with it here is what made me realize later that I should just switch over to the sponge brush instead of using that giant pad. Took me too long to realize that, but better late than never. There were several times I did wish that I had some 2-inch sponge brushes in my collection rather than just so many tiny ones, though. Leaving this clip in solely to tell people not to do this. I thought pouring it on would help me get a more even coat. At this point, I was still using the giant sponge, and I thought it would be the better way to do it. It was not. It was not the better way. You don't want this much stain in one coat. Most of this is going to come off. You're just going to waste it. And also, it was incredibly hard to take off. I had noticed that there were a bunch of different colors of wood, like types of wood used to make this cabinet, both pieces that were veneered, pieces that weren't veneered, and then the pieces that weren't veneered were also different types of wood. So I didn't think it would be that big of a deal for me to use a sheet of maple plywood, which was yet another color for the back. But what I didn't realize was that it would not take the stain in the same way at all. And when I went back to wipe away the stain from the plywood, it was vastly different. And because I had been a fool in applying it, it was also really streaky and the colors were all different on it. And in general, the plywood came out terribly. Like, out of all the pieces of this project, that was my biggest failure, was staining those 2 pieces of plywood. The bottom, in the end, I mean, it's the bottom of the cabinet. I put stuff in it. It's all covered up. I didn't worry about it. But I did angst for a really long time over what to do about the back piece of the cabinet because it was so visible and it had just turned out so badly. But I did eventually figure out a solution. And you caught a glimpse of that in the intro, and I'll talk more about it at the reveal. Once I was done applying all the stain, I needed to let it set for a couple of days. And honestly, it was kind of the best thing because I felt really bad about the job I had done. And I was like, oh, did I ruin it? Am I going to have to start all over? Oh my God, am I going to have to sand everything again? Can I even? And it allowed me some breathing room and also the opportunity to work on some of the other projects in the craft room that I was excited about tackling.
This was the easiest little project, and I am having an absolute out of proportion amount of joy from it. There's something about just looking at the stool and not seeing the red pro lift that just makes me very happy. Step one, if you will. Well, I mean, we will because I'm the only one here. And then I got the film put up on the doors. I love this so much. And y'all, it is ridiculously easy to put this stuff up. It is like a static cling type thing, and you just spray some water on the back of it, spray some water on the door, and then slap it up there. It moves around a lot. So it made positioning it on these like larger sections much easier than I thought it would be. There are still some bubbles. However, you can only see them from certain angles. And for the first few days, I thought that it had gone super perfectly and I felt very accomplished. However, not so much. It's fine. It's still perfect from the front, and that's what really matters, right? I've got this. It's a corkboard. A long time ago, I covered it in fabric. It used to have a bunch of pictures on it and be hanging up in my room. Frida decided that it made a really great scratching post. But so I took it down, took all the photos off of it, and I'm going to put it up in here, and I can have plans and sketches and whatever my little heart desires. But I do want to recover it. Not because I hate this fabric, but because it's been on here a really long time and I want something different. So I pulled this guy out of my stash. Look at how fun this is. So good. I just love the colors and the shininess. And I feel like once I put this on there, it'll just be a little bit more magical vibes in here while still not overpowering whatever I decide to actually put on the board itself.
Taking off all these little thumbtacks was incredibly satisfying. And I enjoyed the excuse to check out my button collection again, which I don't know if this happens to everybody, but when I have stuff out, whether it be on the walls or just on a table or whatever, it's like I stop seeing it after a while. And so it isn't until I need to look at it for some reason, whether that to be cleaning it or, in this case, redoing the board or picking it up because Salvador knocked it off a shelf, that I really see it again and enjoy it to its fullest. I was also able to use this red piece of fabric as a pattern piece, which saved me having to measure the board and mark out my new piece of fabric.
One of the best parts about a project like this, and the stool too, is just, it's easy, it is quick, and it's not fiddly, right? Like, in my case, I didn't take the other cover off of the stool. I didn't want to have to deal with all the foam and all of that. So I just applied the fabric on top of it and stapled it on the base and then screwed it back together. And this is kind of the same. I do want to serge the edges of this fabric just because it's so frayy Like, I haven't touched this stuff, and yet it's everywhere. So I am going to do that just to save future me some heartache. But other than that, I mean, I could even just fold it over. It looks like I had plenty to do so. So I might just do that. I have an electric stapler. You don't need an electric stapler. I originally did this with a hand stapler and it stayed up for years. It's a beautifully easy project that can make a big difference in your space, basically. Like, go out there. And you don't have to do it on a corkboard or either. I like it because I like to have stuff. Like, I like to have a place where I can just tack things up. But in general, it takes nothing. If you have like a section of wall, and then instead of tacking into the wall itself, you could use safety pins. So then you're just attaching stuff to the fabric. And you've made this thing that looks good, even if you don't have a ton up there yet, but also enhances whatever you're doing. Either way, I will be very glad to get this back up on the wall, as opposed to just hiding it from the cats.
The rest of this process really is just stapling the fabric down and making sure that it's taut enough and folding in the corners in such a way that makes you happy. Once the stain had had a couple of days to dry and I didn't feel a complete failure anymore, I went in with a spray shellac just to give it a light protective coat. I didn't want a full, like 2 or 3 layers of shellac as a protection, just because I didn't want the piece to be that shiny. I ended up being able to spray this protective layer on there and then buff in a layer of beeswax as a final protective finish. And I really, really like the effect that that gave. In the end, it's kind of a satin or semi-gloss rather than a full glossy finish. While I had the tarps out and I was spray painting stuff, I pulled out these 2 pegboards that I bought to put up on the wall. They didn't really come in a color that I liked particularly much. So when I picked up the shellac, I picked up a can of this metallic dark champagne and gave them a little facelift.
Got the pegboard and the shelves and the corkboard all mounted. Really excited about that. I have all these tiny, like, new styles of push pins. These are magnetic, and the ones that look like little maps, like map pins. And then these adorable, tiny clothespins. And they will be the first thing on the shelves. In general, because of the way this wall is set up, wouldn't recommend emulating how I secured or didn't secure these in. But I think they'll be fine. I'm not putting anything overly heavy on them, and they are into actual wood. It's just, especially for the pegboard, there weren't enough places to actually mount them in all 6 holes. So I did the ones I could. If it turns out to be a problem, I can always shim up with wood blocks. But, you know, in the meantime, I'll be careful. Or try to be anyway. I just love the way this looks. I'm so happy with it. I am going to get some tools hung up here, figure out how to organize this storage, at least for the moment. I highly anticipate this changing around a lot until I find what I feel like is the most workable solution.
Everything about how I put these pegboards together was vibes. I was just looking at all my different hand tools, finding all the places that I had squirreled them away, and trying to put them up in a way that made sense at the time. Who knows how much sense it will make to me later. And it's possible that the next time you see this, everything about it will have changed. Which is a really nice thing about pegboards. If something's not working, it's the easiest thing in the world to just change it and figure out something else that does. The downside being that all of the little pieces that go into the pegboard are sold separately. So if I want a specific type of attachment, I will have to buy some more of those in the future. I have some extras, but not anything that I can see myself needing, of course.
Friendly reminder that you should always get a sample of a new paint color and bring it to the space that you want to use it in. I'm sorry, so I had this terracotta and I was like, okay, maybe this will work. And then this, something that starts with a K, sunset. And they look completely different in the store. They're not looking particularly like they are in the camera either. This looks suspiciously like skin. It's a skin tone, like a peachy kind of, like when you see skin in comic books. That is the color I think of, like a little bit darker, but still, the base is maybe a little disturbing. Hi, surprise. I'm gonna paint the molding. Both at the bottom of this wall, which I actually had to replace and do some wall repair. So that was fun and exciting. And then this is the whole scope creep that I think I have talked to y'all about already before, that I want to put molding all around these doors to make it look more like Portal-esque, like you're really stepping through something to get into the house or into this room. And even though I'm the only one who's going to be stepping through it, I shall be stepping through a fun fantasy portal when I go through. So I have some of the molding necessary, but not all of it because they were out. I'm also going to do the same molding around the window that's right next to that door, so it'll be kind of a matching set. I have not decided yet whether I'm going to put the film on that window. Right now, I like being able to look out there. It's nice to be able to see something. So yeah, that is the plan. And the other major plan for this wall is I have a lot of space above the door and the window. And thanks to like mainlining some Closet Historian, I really, really want to put up a fun like stencil border up there. And I've been looking at different designs and trying to figure stuff out, and I've got the design elements worked out. Like I know what I want to use in them, but I have not finalized the actual design. And also, I'm not gonna lie, color choice is my enemy. I like color, mostly black, if you look at my wardrobe, but I do like colors. I think it would add a lot to put in some new colors in the space, but I haven't decided which ones, and it's been a journey. So that will be the next phase. Also on the phase 2 list is the labels for all of these collapse boxes. Part of this is me continuingly moving stuff around and going from box to box and just finding a situation that I enjoy in the organization before I go through all the work of making the cards. And part of it is that I'm so picky. And I found the perfect font that I want to use. And I found the perfect, like, pigment-based ink that I want to use on them. And of course, that means I need to learn how to write the font. And this beautiful set of windows, I say rather sarcastically, I am going to put, like, I see all these shops that have like high storage for like larger items that aren't so heavy. And I could put my leather stuff up there. I could put some of these boards up there, just like larger items. But I do want to build a set of shelves that will then span these kind of beams. Oh my gosh, y'all, I can't believe I actually got this done. Oh, look at it. I'm so happy. I'm so happy it's done, mainly, I'll be honest. I really love the color next to the other cabinet. Obviously, and I'll have talked about this a lot when I go through the staining process, I learned a lot, is what I'm gonna say. I learned a lot. And then I also decided I couldn't deal with the plywood and how poorly that turned out. So I covered it with this piece of fabric because the plywood was making me sad, so I looked for something that made me happy. And this golden fabric is what I used as the liner for the surcoat I made for a character that I'm playing that is like a magical Dembo sorcerer. So now whenever I look in here, I'll be happy instead of sad. And if I hate it, well, easy enough to replace. It's actually just held in with some brad nails in the back. It's a little harder to close and open now than it was when I got it. When I was putting the hinges back on, there's a little futzing, and I think a little bit of adjustment will be needed. But overall, honestly, like, considering how many different types of wood were in here, how much harder I made it on myself by doing the process wrong for so long, and then just the years of sanding that I ended up having to do, I am happy. happy. I'm so happy. And it looks so good in here. Like, it fits the space perfectly, and it really gives me what I wanted. It gives me what I wanted out of the space itself.
So here's where I'm at the end of what I would consider phase one of this project. I'm really happy with how things turned out. The cabinet, for all the angst, I'm so happy with it. And the room feels really different, even though none of the other projects that I did in there were super, super involved. I've got a ton of ideas for phase two, including putting in that extra molding, painting it all, painting the back door, putting up the border on the wall above the sliding doors, artwork, the extra set of shelving, all kinds of stuff. But I think that I'm going to take a break from working on this room to work in this room. And I'm really excited to make something and figure out how it works and how it doesn't. So thank you all for watching and coming with me so far. And I hope I will see you again next time.
Hi. Why are you yelling at me? Hi. Hello. This is a rare occurrence. Do you want something? Do you want something? Hi, Salvador. Hi, baby. Hi, baby. Aw. Salvador giving his seal of approval to everything. Must investigate. Must investigate.